Chapter 8. For reasons unfathomable to the most experienced prophets in Macomb County, autumn turned to winter that year. We had 2 weeks of the coldest weather since 1885, Atticus said. Mr. Avery said it was written on the Rosetta Stone that when children disobeyed their parents, smoked cigarettes, and made war on each other, the seasons would change. Jim and I were burdened with the guilt of contributing to the aberrations of nature, thereby causing unhappiness to our neighbors and discomfort to ourselves. All right, so we have here two things that we want to check on. One is a reference that it's just good to know because this comes up a lot, the idea of the Rosetta Stone. The other is the word aberration. Let's do our vocab word first. So, aberration, a characteristic that deviates from the normal type. So their characterization of the weather as being aberrant means that it's different from what they would expect. It's different from what is normal. So let's add that in. Different from the norm. Next, we are going to look up that other reference here. Rosetta Stone. Okay, now the Rosetta Stone, we want to make sure that we're looking up the actual Rosetta Stone and not the language program. So this is a stone slab found in 1799 near Rosetta, having inscriptions in Greek and Egyptian hieroglyphics and Demotic characters, making it possible to decipher ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics. Okay, so the reason that we know what hieroglyphics are and what they say is because we found the Rosetta Stone, and so we were able to translate them into modern languages. So when he says that it was written in the Rosetta Stone, that's obviously not quite accurate, but mostly they would just think of the Rosetta Stone as this ancient prophesying thing. In reality, that's not what it is at all. Old Mrs. Radley died that winter, but her death caused hardly a ripple. The neighborhood seldom saw her, except when she watered her cannas. Jim and I decided that Boo had got her at last, but when Atticus returned from the Radley house, he said she died of natural causes, to our disappointment. Ask him, Jim whispered. You ask him, you're the oldest. That's why you ought to ask him. Atticus, I said, did you see Mr. Arthur? Atticus looked sternly around his newspaper at me. I did not. Jim restrained me from further questions. He said that Atticus was still touchish about us and the Radleys, and it wouldn't do to push him away. Let's check out that vocabulary word, touchish. Overly sensitive. Jim had a notion that Atticus thought our activities that night last summer were not solely confined to strip poker. Jim had no firm basis for his ideas. He said it was merely a twitch. Next morning I awoke, looked out the window, and nearly died of fright. My screams brought Atticus from his bathroom half-shaven. The world's ending, Atticus! Please do something! I dragged him to the window and pointed. No, it's not, he said. It's snowing. Jim said Atticus would keep it up. Jim had never seen snow either, but he knew what it was. Atticus said he didn't know any more about snow than Jim did. I think, though, if it's watery like that, it'll turn to rain. The telephone rang, and Atticus left the breakfast table to answer it. That was Eula May, he said when he returned. I quote, As it has not snowed in Macomb County since 1885, there will be no school today. Eula May was Macomb's leading telephone operator. She was entrusted with issuing public announcements, wedding invitations, setting off the fire siren, and giving first aid instructions when Dr. Reynolds was away. When Atticus finally called us to order and bade us to look at our plates instead of out the window, Jim asked, How do you make a snowman? I haven't the slightest idea, said Atticus. I don't want you all to be disappointed, but I doubt if there will be enough snow for a snowball even. So I like this image. It really feeds into the idea that we have that people in the South have no understanding of how to drive in the snow or even what snow is. And to be fair, most of them probably don't. And especially at this time when you didn't have nationwide news or internet, or most people had probably never even seen a picture of snow. Calpurnia came in and said she thought it was sticking. When we ran to the backyard, it was covered with a feeble layer of soggy snow. We shouldn't walk about in it, said Jim. Look, every step you're taking is wasting it. I looked back at my mushy footprints. Jim said if we waited until it snowed some more, we could scrape it all up for a snowman. I stuck out my tongue and caught a fat flake. It burned. Jim, it's hot. No, it ain't. It's so cold it burns. Now don't eat it, Scout. You're wasting it. Let it come down. But I want to walk in it. I know what. We can go walk over at Miss Maudie's. Jim hopped the front yard. I followed in his tracks. When we were on the sidewalk in front of Miss Maudie's, Mr. Avery accosted us. He had a big pink face and a big stomach below his belt. See what you've done, he said. Hasn't snowed in Macomb since Appomattox. It's bad children like you makes the season change. I wondered if Mr. Avery knew how hopefully we'd watched last summer for him to repeat his performance, and I reflected that if this was our reward, there was something to say for sin. I did not wonder where Mr. Avery gathered his meteorological statistics. They came straight from the Rosetta Stone. Jim Finch! You Jim Finch? Miss Maudie's calling you, Jim. You all stay in the middle of the yard. There's some thrift buried into the snow near the porch. Don't step on it. Yes'm, called Jim. It's beautiful, ain't it, Miss Maudie? Beautiful, my hind foot. If it freezes tonight, it'll carry off all my azaleas. Miss Maudie's old sun hat glistened with snow crystals. She was bending over some small bushes, wrapping them in burlap bags. Jim asked her what she was doing that for. Keep 'em warm, she said. Well, how can flowers keep warm? They don't circulate. I cannot answer that question, Jim Finch. All I know is if it freezes tonight, these plants will freeze, so you cover 'em up. Is that clear? Yes'm. Miss Maudie? What, sir? Could Scout and me borrow some of your snow? Heavens alive, take it all. There's no peach basket under the house. Haul it off in that. Miss Maudie's eyes narrowed. Jim Finch, what are you going to do with my snow? You'll see, said Jim, and we transferred as much snow as we could from Miss Maudie's yard to ours. A slushy operation. What are we going to do, Jim? I asked. You'll see, he said. Now get the basket and haul all the snow you can rake up from the backyard to the front. Walk back in your tracks, though, he cautioned. Are we going to have a snow baby, Jim? No, a real snowman. Gotta work hard now. Jim ran to the backyard, producing the garden hoe, and began digging quickly behind the woodpile, placing any worms he found at one side. He went into the house, returned with a laundry hamper, filled it with earth, and carried it to the front yard. When we had 5 baskets of earth and 2 baskets of snow, Jim said we were ready to begin. Don't you think this is kind of a mess? I asked. Well, it looks messy now, but it won't later, he said. Jim scooped up an armful of dirt, patted it into a mound on which he added another load, and another, until he constructed a torso. Jim, I ain't ever heard of a nigger snowman, I said. Well, he won't be black long, he grunted. Jim procured some peach tree switches from the backyard, plated them, and bent them into the bones to be covered with dirt. So plated, if you're unfamiliar with that term, is another term for braided. He looks like Stephanie Crawford with her hands on her hips, I said. Fat in the middle and little bitty arms. I'll make 'em bigger. Jim sloshed water over the mud man and added more dirt. He looked thoughtfully at it for a moment, and then he molded a big stomach below the figure's waistline. Jim glanced at it, his eyes twinkling. Mr. Avery is sort of shaped like a snowman, ain't he? Jim scooped up some of the snow and began plastering it on. He permitted me to cover only the back, saving the public parts for himself. Gradually, Mr. Avery turned white. Using bits of wood for eyes, nose, mouth, and buttons, Jim succeeded in making Mr. Avery look cross. A bit of stove wood completed the picture. Jim stepped back and viewed his creation. It's lovely, Jim, I said. Looks almost like he talked to you. It is, ain't it? He said shyly. We could not wait for Atticus to come home for dinner, but called and said we had a big surprise for him. He seemed surprised when he saw most of the backyard and the front yard, but said we had done a Jim dandy job. I didn't know how you were going to do it, he said to Jim, But from now on, I'll never worry about what'll become of you, son. You'll always have an idea. Jim's ears reddened from Atticus's compliment, but he looked up sharply when he saw Atticus stepping back. Atticus squinted at the snowman a while. He grinned and then laughed. Son, I can't tell what you're going to be. An engineer, a lawyer, or a portrait painter. You perpetrated near libel here in the front yard. We've got to disguise this fellow. Okay, so we have here a word that is a good vocabulary word, but is also a word that lawyers use and has a specific legal definition. So, libel. A published false statement that's damage to a person's reputation. A written defamation. Atticus is referring to the snowman as libel. He's not saying that Jim wrote something that is false, but he's saying that Jim kind of caricaturized their neighbors here. He's not using that in the strict legal definition, but he is just using it as an example of mocking someone. Atticus suggested that Jim hone down his creature's front a little, swap a broom for the stove wood, and put an apron on him. Jim explained that if he did that, the snowman would become muddy and cease to be a snowman. I don't care what you do as long as you do something, said Atticus. You can't go around making caricatures of the neighbors. Ain't a caricature, said Jim. It looks just like him. Mr. Avery might not think so. I know what, said Jim. He raced across the street, disappeared into Miss Maudie's backyard, and returned triumphant. He stuck her sun hat on the snowman's head and jammed her hedge clippers into the crook of his arm. Atticus said that would be fine. Miss Maudie opened her front door and came out on the porch. She looked across the street at us. Suddenly she grinned. Jim Finch, she called. You devil, bring me back my hat, sir. Jim looked at Atticus, who shook his head. She's just fussing, he said. She's really impressed with your accomplishments. Atticus strolled over to Miss Maudie's sidewalk, where they engaged in an arm-waving conversation. The only phrase of which I caught was, erected an absolute morphodite in that yard. Atticus, you'll never raise him. Let's pop this one in here. Morphodite. Morphodite was a kind of old-timey word for hermaphrodite, or somebody who's intersex or looks like they could be male or female. So, yeah, there you are. The snow stopped in the afternoon. The temperature dropped, and by nightfall, Mr. Avery's direst predictions came true. Calpurnia kept every fireplace in the house blazing, but we were cold. When Atticus came home that evening, he said we were in for it and asked Calpurnia if she wanted to stay with us for the night. Calpurnia glanced up at the high ceilings and long windows and said she thought she'd be warmer at her house. Atticus drove her home in the car. Before I went to sleep, Atticus put more coal on the fire in my room. He said the thermometer registered 16, that it was the coldest night in his memory, and that our snowman outside was frozen solid. Minutes later, it seemed, I was awakened by somebody shaking me. Atticus's overcoat was spread across me. Is it morning already? Okay, so let's pause here. Let's add some stuff into the notes. So while we don't need to worry about the building of the snowman as a key event, we do have a key event in the fact that it snowed at all. So we're going to add in built the snowman here. There's something to keep in mind. But over here, we're going to add it snowed. And under the key events, actually, no, let's do it here under the notes because it'll contribute to the key event. We'll put Miss Maudie was worried about her plants freezing. And that's going to be kind of important for what happens here. Baby, get up. Atticus was holding out my bathrobe and coat. Put your robe on first, he said. Jim was standing beside Atticus, groggy and tousled. He was holding his overcoat closed at the neck. His other hand was jammed into his pocket. He looked strangely overweight. Hurry, hun, said Atticus. Here's your shoes and socks. Stupidly, I put them on. Is it morning? No, it's a little after 1. Hurry now. That something was wrong finally got through to me. What's the matter? By then, he did not have to tell me. Just as birds know where to go when it rains, I knew there was trouble in our streets. Soft feather-like sounds and muffled scurrying sounds filled me with helpless dread. "Whose is it?" "Miss Maudie's, hun," said Atticus gently. At the front door, we saw fire spewing from Miss Maudie's dining room windows. As if to confirm what we saw, the town fire siren wailed up the scale to a treble pitch and remained there, screaming. "It's gone, ain't it?" moaned Jim. "I expect so," said Atticus. "Now listen, both of you. Go down and stand in front of the Radley place. Keep out of the way, you hear? See which way the wind's blowing?" "Oh," said Jim. "Atticus, reckon we ought to start moving the furniture out?" So back before there was standard fire departments and we had all of the smoke detectors and the flame retardant materials that we have today, when a neighbor's house burned down, every house on the entire block was at extreme danger. In fact, while this is obviously set much in the future from this, back in ancient Rome, this was a huge, huge problem. Once one building caught, you could have an entire town go up as it just spread from house to house. "Not yet, son. Do as I tell you. Run now. Take care of Scout, you hear? Don't let her out of your sight." With a push, Atticus started us towards the Radley front gate. We stood watching the street fill with men and cars while fire silently devoured Miss Maudie's house. "Why don't they hurry? Why don't they hurry?" muttered Jim. We saw why. The old fire truck, killed by the cold, was being pushed from town by a crowd of men. When the men attached its hose to a hydrant, the hose burst and water shot up, tinkling down on the pavement. "Oh, Lord, Jim." Jim put his arm around me. "Hush, Scout," he said. "It ain't time to worry yet. I'll let you know when." The men of Maycomb, in all degrees of dress and undress, took furniture from Miss Maudie's house to a yard across the street. I saw Atticus carrying Miss Maudie's heavy oak rocking chair, and thought it was sensible of him to save what she valued most. Sometimes we heard shouts. Then Mr. Avery's face appeared in an upstairs window. He pushed a mattress out the window into the street and threw down furniture until men shouted, "Come down from there, Dick. The stairs are going. Get out of there, Mr. Avery." Mr. Avery began climbing through the window. "Scout, he's stuck," breathed Jim. "Oh, God." Mr. Avery was wedged tightly. I buried my head under Jim's arm and didn't look again until Jim cried, "He got loose, Scout. He's all right." I looked up to see Mr. Avery cross the upstairs porch. He swung his legs over the railing and was sliding down a pillar when he slipped. He fell, yelled, and hit Miss Maudie's shrubbery. Suddenly, I noticed that the men were backing away from Miss Maudie's house, moving down the street towards us. They were no longer carrying furniture. The fire was well into the second floor and had eaten its way to the roof. Window frames were back against a vivid orange center. "Jim, it looks like a pumpkin." "Scout, look." Smoke was rolling off our house and Miss Rachel's house like fog off a riverbank, and men were pulling hoses toward them. Behind us, the fire truck from Abbotsville screamed around the curve and stopped in front of our house. "That book," I said. "What?" said Jim. "That Tom Swift book. It ain't mine, it's Dill's." "Don't worry about it, Scott. It ain't time to worry yet," said Jim. He pointed. "Looky yonder." In a group of neighbors, Atticus was standing with his hands in his overcoat pockets. He might have been watching a football game. Miss Maudie was beside him. "See there? He's not worried yet," said Jim. "Why ain't he on top of one of the houses?" "Well, he's too old. He'd break his neck." "You think we ought to make him get our stuff out?" "Let's don't pester him. He'll know when it's time," said Jim. Okay, so let's pause here. Let's hop back. And in our key events, let's add this in. Miss Maudie's house caught fire and burned down. The Abbotsville fire truck began pumping water on our house. A man on the roof pointed to places that needed it most. I watched our absolute morphodite go black and crumble. Miss Maudie's sun hat settled on the top of the heap. I could not see her hedge clippers. In the heat between our houses, Miss Rachel's and Miss Maudie's, the men had long ago shed coats and bathrobes. They worked in pajama tops and nightshirts stuffed into their pants, but I became aware that I was slowly freezing where I stood. Jim tried to keep me warm, but his arm was not enough. I pulled free of it and clutched my shoulders. By dancing a little, I could feel my feet. Another fire truck appeared and stopped in front of Miss Stephanie Crawford's. There was no hydrant for another hose, and the men tried to soak her house with hand extinguishers. Miss Maudie's tin roof quelled the flames. Roaring, the house collapsed. Fire gushed everywhere, followed by a flurry of blankets from men on top of the adjacent houses, beating out sparks and burning chunks of wood. It was dawn before the men began to leave, first one by one and then in groups. They pushed the Macomb fire truck back to town. The Abbotsville fire truck departed. The third one remained. We found out the next day it had come from Clark's Ferry, 60 miles away. Jim and I slid across the street. Miss Maudie was staring at the smoking black hole in her yard, and Atticus shook his head to tell us she did not want to talk. He led us home, holding into her shoulders to cross the icy street. He said Miss Maudie would stay with Miss Stephanie for the time being. "Anybody want some hot chocolate?" he asked. I shuddered when Atticus started a fire in the kitchen stove. As we drank our cocoa, I noticed Atticus looking at me, first with curiosity and then with sternness. "I thought I told you and Jim to stay put," he said. "Well, we did. We stayed." "Well, then whose blanket is that?" "Blanket?" "Yes, ma'am, it isn't ours." I looked down and found myself clutching a brown woolen blanket I was wearing across my shoulders, squaw fashion. "Atticus, I don't know, sir." I turned to Jim for an answer, but Jim was even more bewildered than I. He said he didn't know how it got there. We did exactly as Atticus had told us. We stood down by the Radley gate away from everybody. We didn't move an inch. Jim stopped. "Mr. Nathan was at the fire," he babbled. "I saw him. I saw him. He was tugging that mattress, Atticus, I swear." "That's all right, son." Atticus grinned slowly. "Looks like all of Macomb was out tonight in one way or another. Jim, there's some wrapping paper in the pantry, I think. Go get it and we'll—" "Atticus, no, sir." Jim seemed to have lost his mind. He began pouring out our secrets right and left in total disregard for my safety, if not his own, omitting nothing, knothole, pants, and all. "Mr. Nathan put cement in that tree, Atticus, and he did it to stop us from finding things. He's crazy, I reckon, like they say, but Atticus, I swear to God he ain't ever harmed us. He ain't ever hurt us. He could have cut my throat from ear to ear that night, but he tried to mend my pants instead. He ain't ever hurt us, Atticus." Atticus said, "Whoa, son," so gently that I was greatly heartened. It was obvious that he had not followed a word Jim had said, for all Atticus said was, "You're right. We better keep this and the blanket to ourselves. Someday, maybe, Scout can thank him for covering her up." "Thank who?" I asked. "Boo Radley. You were so busy looking at the fire, you didn't know it when he put the blanket around you." My stomach turned to water, and I nearly threw up when Jim held out a blanket and crept towards me. He sneaked out of the house, turned around, sneaked out, and went like this. Atticus said dryly, "Do not let this inspire you to further glory, Jeremy." Jim scowled. "I ain't gonna do nothing to him." But I watched the spark of fresh adventure leave his eyes. "Just think, Scout," he said, "if you'd have just turned around, you'd have seen him." Calpurnia woke us at noon. Atticus said we need not go to school that day. We learned nothing after no sleep. Calpurnia said for us to try and clean up the front yard. Miss Maudie's sun hat was suspended in a thin layer of ice, like a fly in amber, and we had to dig under the dirt for her hedge clippers. We found her in her backyard, gazing at her frozen, charred azaleas. "We're bringing your things back, Miss Maudie," said Jim. "We're awful sorry." Miss Maudie looked around, and the shadow of her old grin crossed her face. "I always wanted a smaller house, Jim Finch. Give me more yard. Just think, I have more room for my azaleas now." "You ain't grieving, Miss Maudie?" I asked, surprised. Atticus said her house was nearly all she had. "Grieving, child? Why, no, I hated that old cow barn. Thought of setting fire to it 100 times myself, except they locked me up. But don't you worry about me, Jean Louise. There are ways of doing things you don't even know about. Why, I'll build me a little house and take a couple of roomers. Gracious, I'll have the finest yard in Alabama. This Bellingrass will look plain puny when I get started." Jim and I looked at each other. "How'd it catch, Miss Maudie?" he asked. "I don't know, Jim. Probably the flue in the kitchen. I kept a fire in there last night for my potted plants. Hear you had some unexpected company last night, Miss Jean Louise." "How'd you know?" "Atticus told me on his way to town this morning. Tell you the truth, I'd like to have been with you, and I'd have had enough sense to turn around, too." Miss Maudie puzzled me. With most of her possessions gone and her beloved yard in shambles, she still took a lively and cordial interest in Jim and my affairs. She must have seen my perplexity. She said, "Only thing I worried about last night was all the danger and commotion it caused. This whole neighborhood could have gone up. Mr. Avery will be in bed for a week. He's right stove up. He's too old to do things like that, and I told him so. As soon as I can get my hands clean, and when Miss Stephanie Crawford's not looking, I'll make him a lane cake. And Stephanie's been after my recipe for 30 years, and if she thinks I'll give it to her just because I'm staying with her, she's got another thing coming." I reflected that if Miss Maudie broke down and gave it to her, Miss Stephanie couldn't follow it anyway. Miss Maudie had once let me see it. Among other things, the recipe called for 1 large cup of sugar. It was still day. The air was so cold and clear that we heard the courthouse clock clank, rattle, and strain before it struck the hour. Miss Maudie's nose was a color I had never seen before, and I inquired about it. "I've been out here since 6 o'clock," she said. "Should be frozen by now." She held up her hands. A network of tiny lines crisscrossed her palms, brown with dirt and dried blood. "You've ruined 'em," said Jim. "Why don't you get a colored man?" There was no note of sacrifice in his voice when he added, "Or Scout and me, we can help you." Miss Maudie said, "Thank you, sir, but you've got a job of your own over there." She pointed to our yard. "You mean the morphodite?" I asked. "Shoot, we can rake him up in a jiffy." Miss Maudie stared down at me, her lips moving silently. Suddenly, she put her hands to her head and whooped. When we left her, she was still chuckling. Jim said he didn't know what was the matter with her. That was just Miss Maudie. All right, so we are going to end our reading for the chapter here, but we have some things that we are going to include. So let's add here that who Radley gave Scout, I can spell. Who Radley gave Scout a blanket. Now let's go over here and add a note. Miss Maudie isn't too upset about the loss of her house. And then let's add in this word, optimist. So she's an optimist. She always sees the good in things. There's always a silver lining to the dark clouds. But now let's add in one more question. It's a really good one. And after we write it down, I want you to think about it for a second before we come up with our answer. What does the burning house symbolize? Authors write, they don't just drop things in randomly. Things mean things. What do you think the idea of the burning house symbolizes? What is it supposed to represent? So pause here. Think about your answer for a second, and then we'll come up with it. I think that the burning house symbolizes change. We have these old houses. They're usually a representation of Southern life. How fine and old your family is represented by how fine and old your house is. So this idea that Southern life is all about these things, and what happens when they burn down? What happens with these symbols of Southern life and Southern propriety go away? We start seeing things that are otherwise normally hidden. A change of the view of Southern life and the things that society, especially white society, keeps hidden. We can view this as a way that things are about to change. One other thing that we can add in here that I find really interesting, let's actually ask this as a question before we answer it. What did Boo Radley giving Scout the blanket signify? Now, there's a lot to unpack here. So take a second and think about it. I think that Boo Radley giving Scout the blanket tells us a lot of things about this story. For much of the first half of the book, he was the obsession of these kids as they were going around. But here, where he actually appears, he is not what they're focused on anymore. So he's kind of a signifier, not only that things have changed, like with Miss Maudie's house, but also that the things that were so important to them in the past kind of go away in the face of this new threat to their safety and their security. Additionally, it tells us something about Boo Radley himself. So up until now, they've had this idea that Boo Radley was this monster, this evil creature that lived at the end of the block and nobody ever saw him, and there was all these urban legends about him. But we've learned a few things about him. He sews up their pants when they need it. Even though he doesn't like to be seen, when they need him, he'll be there. He'll show up and take care of the kids and protect them and do whatever he needs to do. So that's not typically the behavior of somebody who's a monster. It tells us a little bit more about who he is. He's not such a bad guy. He's kind of this dark, hidden figure that's out there to protect people from the shadows. Interestingly enough, it's kind of the trait that a lot of superheroes have, where they are there when you need them. They're the heroes that Gotham needs. But during the daylight hours, they're nowhere to be seen. All right. This ends Chapter 8 for To Kill a Mockingbird. Next is Chapter 9.